So there was a time in my life when I thought I understood how short life really is. My mother died from cancer when she was 50 years old, and my grandfather died from a heart attack at 52. My best friend, who was also my first cousin, died from a widowmaker heart attack when we were 31 years old. Same blood, same family tree. And if anybody should have understood that tomorrow isn't promised, it should have been me. But looking back at it, I realize I didn't understand it at all because I spent decades doing the same thing that most people do. I kept waiting, waiting for life to settle down, waiting for things to get easier, waiting for the right circumstances, waiting for someday. And it took me until, now, my mid 50s, to realize that someday isn't guaranteed. It's definitely not promised. You know, in fact, someday has a way of turning into never. The evidence was always there. My mother never got to enjoy the life that she spent years building. And my grandfather, worked hard his entire life and never really got to enjoy the reward at all for all of those years that he did live. And my cousin was only 31 years old. He had a 6-year-old son. He wasn't done building his life. He wasn't looking back on memories. He was still trying to create them. Then one day he was gone. And if I'm being honest, part of me always knew, exactly what those losses meant. But another part of me still lived like, I had all the time in the world. I think that's what most of us do. We know tomorrow isn't promised. We know life is fragile. And we've all heard it 1,000 times. But hearing something and living like you believe it are two totally different things. Then at 49, I broke my back. And I remember sitting there while doctors told me I would probably never walk again. you know, Not walk normally, not have limitations, but never walk again. You know, Thank God that didn't turn out to be the case. But, they wanted me on disability. They didn't think I would ever return to work, but I did. And for 2 years, I walked with a cane and a back brace. And even today, I still live with the consequences of that accident. My teeth were damaged in that wreck, and I still haven't been able to afford to fix them. And yeah, I still have pain, from my back. I live with it every day. But it is what it is. And looking back at that should have, been the very moment where everything changed. That should have been the moment that I stopped assuming there would always be, more time or more tomorrows. And then at 51, my marriage ended. I lost my home, lost pretty much everything I owned, and walked away with a pickup truck and, a handful of clothes. Then, spent 6 months living in the truck. Spent another year living in a camper. Started over from scratch. And even then, I still wasn't fully getting the lesson. Just because life teaches us something, doesn't mean that we actually learn it. Sometimes life has to teach us the same lesson over and over again. A few days ago, I read something. It was a comment, and it stuck with me. Someone was talking about a breakfast that they had with their sister years ago. Just breakfast, nothing special. A conversation, some laughter, some time together. 6 months later, her sister died from cancer. And that breakfast became one of the memories, that she carried with her. What struck me wasn't the cancer, it wasn't even the loss, it was the breakfast. Because when they sat down that morning, they didn't know that it mattered. It was just breakfast. And that's how life works. The moments that become priceless usually look completely ordinary while they're happening. The last fishing trip, the last phone call, the last holiday, the last conversation, the last time that you'll ever hear somebody laugh. The last time that you maybe even, hug somebody you love. Nobody tells you that it's the last time. If they did, we'd all pay a little bit more attention. you we'd stay a little longer. Listen a little harder. Put the damn phone down. You know, be a little more present. But life doesn't work that way. You only realize just how important a moment is after it becomes a memory. and I think that's why my perspective has changed so much these last few years. After losing everything, after sleeping in a truck, after rebuilding my life, after starting over again at an age when most people think life is supposed to be figured out, I finally started understanding something that I should have understood a long time ago. I'd spent my entire life watching people run out of time, and somehow I still thought I had more. You know, my mother didn't get forever. My grandfather didn't get forever. My cousin didn't get forever. And neither have the dozens of friends and family members whose funerals that I've sat through over the years. In fact, the older I get, the more it feels like those funerals come faster. Every year, another phone call, another obituary, another person that you thought would be around longer. Yet somehow, I'm still here. Still standing, still breathing, still getting another chance that they didn't get. 10 toes up. And maybe, that's what finally changed for me. Because at some point, I had to ask myself a very hard question. If all of those people would give anything for one more day, you know, maybe one more fishing trip, one more breakfast, one more conversation, one more chance to do the things that they've kept putting off, then what exactly am I waiting for? What am I waiting for? Because that's exactly what I was doing. Waiting. Waiting for life to start. Waiting for certainty. Waiting for someday. But someday isn't promised. The only thing that any of us really have is today. Today, right now. And, strangely enough, I don't find that depressing anymore. I find it motivating. Because if time is limited, then today matters. Friendships matter. Fishing matters. Trying new things matters. Taking yourself to dinner matters. Starting over matters. Living matters. Yeah, that one. Living matters. Not existing, not surviving, living. You know, I used to think I understood that, you know, that tomorrow wasn't promised. Truth is, I didn't. Because if I truly understood it, I would have stopped waiting years ago. And maybe, you know, that's what I wanted to share today. Not that life is short, everybody already knows that. But the question is whether, we're actually living like we know it, because someday sounds like a plan until one day you realize someday never arrived. Folks, I'll see you in the next one.